I did not know that shame had a sound until I heard the ballroom fall silent around me. One moment there was music, laughter, the gentle collision of crystal and conversation, and the next there was only the terrible weight of 300 pairs of eyes, turning toward where I stood beside the terrace doors, my gloved hand still resting on the cold brass handle. Lady Pemberton's voice had carried farther than she intended, or perhaps exactly as far as she wished. The words hung in the air like smoke from snuffed candles, acrid and unmistakable. Inappropriate conduct, a widow's shame, unbecoming behavior with a gentleman not her late husband. I watched the accusation spread across the faces nearest me, saw it transform into certainty before I could draw breath to deny it. In that suspended moment, I understood that truth mattered less than appearance, and I had been caught in the terrible machinery of reputation. The Earl of Harrogate moved through the frozen crowd with the deliberate grace of a man who knew his own power. He was 50, perhaps, silver threading through dark hair, his face carved into lines of authority, softened only slightly by what might have been sympathy. This was his estate, his ball, his guests who now formed a living corridor as he approached. I wanted to run. I wanted to disappear into the November night beyond those terrace doors, to let the cold gardens swallow me whole. But I was Eleanor Ashford, daughter of a baron, widow of a decorated officer, and I would not grant them the satisfaction of my flight. The Earl stopped 3 paces from me, and I saw something flicker in his dark eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or theatrical instinct. He had been a diplomat once, I remembered, a man who understood the staging of moments. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of that glittering room. "You stand accused, Lady Ashford," he said. And though his tone was formal, there was no cruelty in it. In such matters, our traditions allow you a choice. You may answer these charges yourself, or you may invoke the old custom and choose a champion to defend your name. A man of honor who will stand as your advocate and, if necessary, answer any challenge made against your reputation. The gasps that followed were like wind through dead leaves. The custom was ancient, half forgotten, something from another century when honor was settled with more than cutting words and withdrawn invitations. I had read of it in my grandfather's library, never imagining I would live to see it invoked. My heart hammered against the boning of my corset. To choose a champion was to place my entire fate in another's hands, to trust that someone would risk everything for the sake of my name. I scanned the crowd and found only averted gazes, suddenly fascinating refreshments, urgent need to examine the painted ceiling. These people who had taken my late husband's hospitality, who had called me friend when I wore mourning and posed no threat to their daughter's prospects, now studied their shoes as though the parquet floor held mysteries worth solving. Lord Wessex, who had danced with me twice that evening and whose attention Lady Pemberton had wanted for her own niece, had melted into shadow near the card-room. Even my cousin Robert, who owed me money and kindness both, found pressing business with his cravat, silence stretched thin as wire. The Earl waited, patient as stone, while my humiliation completed itself. I would have no champion. I would stand alone, and tomorrow the scandal sheets would feast on my ruin. Lady Ashford, unable to find a single gentleman willing to vouch for her character. The widow whose shame ran so deep that not even common pity could move a man to her defense. Then I heard it. Footsteps, measured and sure, cutting through the terrible quiet. He came from the far side of the ballroom where the older gentlemen had gathered near the fire, where I had not looked, because I had trained myself years ago not to look in that direction. The crowd parted for him as it had for the Earl, but differently. This was not deference to rank or position. This was something older, something that lived in the spine and recognized danger when it moved with purpose through candlelight. Christopher Hale, Duke of Thornfield, crossed that ballroom as though he owned not just the floor beneath his feet, but the very air we breathed. He was taller than I remembered, or perhaps grief had carved him leaner, all sharp angles and controlled power. His evening clothes were perfectly cut, black, superfine that absorbed light, his cravat tied with the simplicity that spoke of confidence rather than fashion. But it was his face that held me frozen. The same face that had haunted my dreams and waking hours for 5 years, beautiful in the way that cliffs are beautiful, all hard lines and dangerous edges, softened only by the dark gold of his hair and the startling blue of his eyes. Those eyes found mine across the distance, and I forgot how to breathe. I had not stood this close to him since the morning he told me he would marry Catherine Lindley, since the morning my world cracked open and showed me that love was not armor against duty or wealth or the expectations of ancient families. He had chosen his path, and I had chosen to survive it. We had not spoken in 5 years. We had perfected the art of existing in the same rooms, the same city, the same world, without ever truly seeing each other. Until now, when I could see nothing else. He stopped beside the Earl and executed a bow of such precise formality that it bordered on mockery. Not of me, I realized, with a shock that went through me like touching ice. Of them, of this whole theatrical proceeding, this public dismantling of a woman's life for the entertainment of people who called themselves society. "My Lord Harrowgate," he said, and his voice was everything I remembered and had tried to forget. Deep, controlled, with that slight rasp that caught at the edges of certain words. "I offer myself as Lady Ashford's champion. I will answer any charge made against her character, defend her name in whatever manner honor demands, and stake my own reputation upon her innocence." The ballroom erupted, not in sound, not yet, but in movement, heads turning, mouths forming silent questions, fans snapping open to hide whispered speculations. The Duke of Thornfield, stepping forward to defend Eleanor Ashford. The Duke, whose wife had been dead barely a year. The Duke, who everyone knew had not spoken to me, had barely acknowledged my existence since his marriage. Lady Pemberton's face had gone the color of old parchment. She knew, as everyone knew, that to challenge Thornfield was to challenge one of the most powerful families in England. His word carried the weight of 3 centuries of unbroken lineage, vast estates, and the kind of influence that opened doors in Parliament and closed them on enemies. If he declared me innocent, I would be innocent. If he named her accusation false, she would be the one requiring redemption. The Earl looked between us with something that might have been surprise or satisfaction. It was impossible to tell. "Do you accept this champion, Lady Ashford? Do you place your honor in the Duke's keeping?" I should have said no. I should have found my voice and my pride and told them all I needed no man to speak for me, least of all the man who had taught me that love was just another word for abandonment. But I looked at Christopher Hale, at the rigid set of his shoulders and the way his hands were clenched behind his back, and I saw something I could not name. Determination, perhaps, or penance, or simply the same desperate need for redemption that kept me standing when I wanted to fall. "I accept," I said, and my voice did not shake, even though everything inside me was trembling. "I accept the Duke of Thornfield as my champion." His eyes met mine again, just for a moment, and I saw the ghost of something I thought I had buried 5 years ago. Then he turned back to the Earl and to Lady Pemberton, who looked as though she had swallowed something sour and could neither speak nor be silent. The Earl nodded slowly. "Then let it be witnessed by all present. The Duke of Thornfield stands as champion for Lady Eleanor Ashford. Any who would question her character must first answer to him. Any challenge to her name is a challenge to his own." He paused, letting the weight of that settle across the room. "I declare this matter closed unless formal accusations are brought forth within 3 days' time. Until then, Lady Ashford's reputation remains unblemished, protected by the word and honor of her chosen champion." It was masterfully done. 3 days was precisely enough time for Lady Pemberton to either produce genuine evidence of wrongdoing, which we all knew she could not, or to quietly allow the matter to dissolve into the general gossip that fueled society but rarely destroyed it. The threat of facing Thornfield in any official capacity would ensure her silence. She would pay for her spite with diminished standing and the knowledge that she had overplayed her hand. But I barely registered the political maneuvering, the subtle victory being shaped around me. All I could think was that Christopher Hale had spoken my name again after 5 years of careful silence. That he had crossed a ballroom and claimed the right to defend me. That when this was over, when the 3 days passed and my reputation was restored, we would have to face each other and find words for this thing that had just happened between us. The orchestra resumed playing, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Conversation rose like fog, soft and obscuring. The Earl offered me his arm and led me away from the terrace doors, away from the scene of my near destruction, while Thornfield remained behind, accepting congratulations and deflecting questions with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life being watched. I did not look back. I could not bear to see his face again, not yet, not when my own composure was stretched so thin that one more shock might shatter it completely. "Lady Ashford," the Earl said quietly, as we paused near a arrangement of hothouse roses, "you have a most devoted champion. One wonders what inspired such loyalty." I wondered the same thing, I told him, and realized it was the absolute truth. I wondered what had made the man who had broken my heart step forward to defend it. What debt or honor or memory had compelled him to tie his name to mine when he had spent 5 years ensuring they remained separate? The Earl smiled then, and it was not unkind. "In 3 days," he said, "this will all be forgotten. The scandal will belong to Lady Pemberton, not to you. Your champion has given you back your future. But I knew better. Whatever future Thornfield had given me, it was not the one I had possessed an hour ago. That future, where I was simply the quiet widow rebuilding her life in the margins of society, where I could exist in the same rooms as Christopher Hale without feeling my heart crack open with each breath. That future had ended the moment he crossed the ballroom. I did not know yet what this new future would hold. I knew only that it would require me to face him, to speak to him, to somehow survive the proximity of the man I had loved and lost and never quite stopped mourning. The man who was now bound by honor and public declaration to defend my name. The man who, for reasons I could not fathom, had chosen to step back into my life when he could have remained safely distant. I left the ball an hour later, my cousin finally remembering his family obligation and escorting me to my carriage. The night was cold, November asserting itself with frost and the promise of winter. I sat in the darkness as the horses pulled away from Harrowgate House, watching the golden windows recede into the distance, and I pressed my gloved hands against my ribs as though I could physically hold myself together. In 3 days, I would be safe. My reputation would be restored. Life would continue as it had been. But I knew this for the lie it was, because in 3 days, Christopher Hale would no longer be bound to me by the role of champion. In 3 days, we would simply be two people who had once loved each other and who now had to find a way to exist in the same world again. And I had no idea whether that terrified me or offered me the one thing I had thought lost forever: hope. The morning after brought rain and a letter I had not expected to receive. My housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, brought it with my breakfast tray, her expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she had already guessed its significance. The handwriting on the cream envelope was unfamiliar to me, too angular and precise to be from any of my usual correspondence, but the seal pressed into the dark blue wax was unmistakable. The Thornfield crest, a hawk rising above twin towers, marked with the family motto I had once memorized and then tried desperately to forget. I held the letter without opening it while my tea grew cold and the rain drew silver lines down the window glass. This house in Bloomsbury was modest by the standards of my former life, but it was mine, purchased with the small inheritance my husband had left me, and maintained through careful economy and the occasional sale of jewelry I no longer wished to wear. After Thomas died at Waterloo, I had returned to London and built this quiet existence in the margins of society. I attended small gatherings, paid calls on the few friends who had remained loyal through my mourning, and perfected the art of being present but unremarkable, invisible almost, which was precisely what I had wanted. Christopher's letter threatened all of that carefully constructed invisibility. I broke the seal finally, because delaying would not change whatever words waited inside. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind used for formal correspondence. But the message itself was brief, almost curt in its efficiency. Lady Ashford, we must speak regarding the arrangements necessary to fulfill my role as your champion. I will call upon you this afternoon at 3 o'clock if this is convenient. If not, please send word and I will adjust accordingly. Thornfield. No greeting beyond my name, no closing beyond his title, no acknowledgement that we had once been anything other than two people bound by an arcane social custom. I supposed I should have been grateful for the coldness. It would make everything easier if we could treat this as a mere formality, a temporary alliance that would dissolve the moment Lady Pemberton's 3 days expired without formal accusation. But my hands were shaking as I set the letter down, and I knew that nothing about seeing Christopher Hale again would be easy. I spent the morning in useless preparation. I changed my dress 3 times before settling on a morning gown of dark gray silk, high-necked and sober enough to suggest widowhood without the full mourning I had finally set aside 6 months ago. I instructed Mrs. Davies to prepare the front parlor, then second-guessed myself and switched to the smaller sitting room that faced the garden. I wanted the meeting to feel intimate but not presumptuous, formal but not cold. Every choice felt weighted with meaning I could not quite articulate. By the time the clock struck 3, I had worn a path in the carpet and rehearsed a dozen different greetings, all of which sounded false or stilted or too carefully composed. When Mrs. Davies announced him, I was standing by the window with my hands clasped so tightly my fingers had gone numb. He filled the doorway in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size and everything to do with the sheer presence he carried. In daylight, away from the stage drama of the ballroom, he looked older than I remembered, but not diminished. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there 5 years ago, a hardness to his mouth that spoke of grief absorbed and carried. His mourning clothes were impeccably tailored, the black superfine highlighting the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. He had always moved with unconscious grace, but now there was something deliberate in it, as though he had learned to control even the way he occupied space. "Lady Ashford," he said, and executed a bow that was correct to the inch. Nothing more, nothing less. "Your Grace," I replied, and curtsied with equal precision. We were like dancers who had memorized the steps but forgotten the music. He waited until Mrs. Davies had brought tea and withdrawn before speaking again. The silence between us was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It simply was, heavy with the weight of everything we were not saying. I poured tea with hands that remained mercifully steady, grateful for the ritual of it, the small actions that gave me something to do other than look at him directly. "Thank you for receiving me," he said, accepting the cup I offered. "I realize this situation is unusual." "Unusual," I repeated, and something that might have been laughter caught in my throat. "Yes, I suppose that is one word for it." His eyes met mine then, really met them for the first time since he had entered the room, and I felt the impact of it like a physical blow. They were still that impossible blue, the color of deep water or evening sky, and they still saw too much. I had forgotten that about him, or perhaps I had made myself forget. How he could look at me and seem to read thoughts I had not yet formed. "I will not insult you by pretending this is not complicated," he said quietly, "but I meant what I said last night. I will defend your honor in whatever way is required. You have my word." "Why?" The question escaped before I could stop it, raw and unguarded. Why would you do this? Why now, after all this time? Something flickered in his expression, too quick for me to identify. Because it was the right thing to do. Because you did not deserve to be attacked in that manner. Because I could help, and I was in a position to do so. They were good reasons, logical reasons, the kind any gentleman might offer. But they did not explain the way he had crossed that ballroom, the intensity in his eyes when he had spoken my name, the sense that this was more than simple chivalry or social obligation. "Christopher," I began, and his name felt strange and familiar all at once on my lips. He set down his teacup with enough force that the china rattled. "Please do not call me that." The sharpness of it stung. "Your Grace, then. My apologies." "No," he said, and now there was something like pain in his voice. "That is worse somehow, as though we were strangers." "But we are strangers," I said, and I heard the bitterness creep into my tone despite my best efforts. "We have been strangers for 5 years, since the morning you came to tell me you were marrying Catherine Lindley, since the morning you chose duty over whatever it was we had been to each other." He stood abruptly, moving to the window where I had been standing when he arrived. The rain had intensified, turning the garden into a watercolor of grays and greens. "I want to explain," he said to the glass. "I wanted to explain then, but you would not see me. You returned all my letters unopened. You made it clear that you wanted nothing from me." "What could you possibly have said that would have changed anything?" I asked, and I was standing now too, my own composure fracturing. "That you were sorry, that you wished things were different, that you cared for me but your family needed the Lindley fortune and the alliance with her father's shipping interests?" "I knew all of that already, Christopher. I did not need to hear you explain how I was not enough to outweigh those practical considerations." He turned from the window so quickly I took a step back. "Is that what you think? That you were not enough? What else should I think?" My voice was rising, and I could not seem to control it. "You courted me for 6 months. You made me believe that we had a future together. Then one morning, you appeared at my father's house and told me very calmly that you were engaged to someone else, that your family had arranged it, that it was your duty. You did not ask me to wait. You did not suggest any alternative. You simply informed me that whatever had existed between us was over, and then you married her 3 months later." "Because I had no choice," he said, and now his voice matched mine for intensity. "Because my father died and left the estates in ruins. Because there were hundreds of people dependent on Thornfield lands who would have lost everything if I had not found a way to save them. Because Catherine's father offered the capital I needed to prevent complete disaster, but only if I married his daughter." He stopped, visibly forcing himself to calm. "I did not want to hurt you. I tried to do it in a way that would allow you to hate me cleanly, to move on without looking back." "Well," I said, and my throat was so tight I could barely force the words out, "you succeeded admirably. I hated you very cleanly indeed." The silence that followed was different than before. It was not empty but full, charged with 5 years of accumulated pain and misunderstanding and the terrible knowledge that we had both been acting from incomplete information. I had not known about his father's debts, about the crisis that had forced his hand. He had not known that his attempt at clean separation had felt like cruelty rather than kindness. "Catherine knew," he said finally, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it. "She knew that I did not love her. We had an understanding. She would have the title and position her father wanted for her, and I would have the means to save my estates. It was a transaction, nothing more. She did not expect love from me, and I did not pretend to offer it." "How civilized," I said, and I could not keep the acid from my tone. "How very practical." "She was kind," he said, and there was genuine grief in his voice now. "She was a good woman who deserved better than what I could give her. When she became ill last year, I tried to be what she needed. I tried to make her comfortable, to ease her suffering. But I could not give her what she really wanted, which was a husband who loved her rather than one who was grateful for her sacrifice. I sat down because my legs would no longer hold me. The anger was draining away, leaving behind something more complicated and harder to bear. I had spent 5 years hating Christopher for abandoning me, for choosing wealth and duty over love. But the story was more complex than I had known. He had made an impossible choice in an impossible situation, and everyone had paid the price for it. "I am sorry for your loss," I said, because I was, and because it needed to be said. "I am sorry that you both suffered." He returned to his chair, and when he looked at me now, there was a vulnerability in his expression that I had never seen before. Not even in the early days of our courtship, when everything had seemed possible. "I have carried the weight of that morning for 5 years," he said. "The morning I went to your father's house and broke your heart because I was too proud and too desperate to ask for help or time or understanding. I told myself I was protecting you, that it would be easier for you if you could hate me completely. But I was protecting myself too. It was cowardice dressed up as nobility." "And last night?" I asked. "When you stepped forward to defend me, was that cowardice too, or something else?" He held my gaze and did not look away. "Last night, I saw you standing there, alone, with everyone you thought you could trust turning away. I saw what it cost you to keep your head high, to not run or weep or break. And I thought that perhaps this was something I could do. One thing I could do right after so many things had gone wrong between us. I did not know if you would accept me as your champion. I half expected you to refuse, to tell the Earl you would rather face the accusations alone than accept help from me." "I almost did," I admitted. "But then I looked at you, and I thought that perhaps we both deserved a chance at something other than the silence we had been living in." The rain had softened to a steady patter against the windows. The gray afternoon light made the small sitting room feel even more intimate, as though the rest of the world had receded and left only this space, this moment, this tentative rebuilding of something I had thought permanently shattered. "What happens now?" I asked. "In practical terms, what do these 3 days require of us?" Christopher shifted in his chair, and I saw some of the tension leave his shoulders. "We should be seen together publicly," he said. "Not excessively, but enough to demonstrate that I am indeed serving as your champion. Perhaps a drive in the park tomorrow, if the weather clears. And there is a small music hall at Lady Hartwell's tomorrow evening. She is a friend of my late mother's, and her guest list is impeccable. If you are seen there under my escort, it will send a clear message about your social standing." "You have thought this through," I observed. "I spent most of last night considering the options," he admitted. "Lady Pemberton will not bring formal charges. She cannot. But she will try to salvage her position by suggesting that the entire situation was a misunderstanding, that she was merely concerned for your welfare. The best response is to demonstrate that your reputation is not just defended, but strengthened by this incident." It struck me then how strange this was. Discussing strategy and social maneuvering with the man I had once planned to marry, as though we were business partners rather than two people whose lives had been irrevocably tangled together. Yet there was something oddly comforting in it, too. We were finding a way to talk to each other again, even if it was through the framework of this peculiar situation. "I will attend the music hall," I said, "and the drive in the park, weather permitting, whatever else you think necessary." "There is one more thing," he said, and something in his tone made me look at him more closely. "The formal language in these matters can be arcane, but as your champion, I have certain rights and responsibilities, including the right to know if the accusations had any basis in truth." The question hung between us, unspoken but unmistakable. He was asking if I had been conducting an inappropriate relationship with someone, if Lady Pemberton's spite had been grounded in genuine scandal. I met his eyes steadily. "No," I said. "There was nothing inappropriate in my conduct. Lord Wessex danced with me twice, and we spoke of his travels to Italy. That was the extent of it. Lady Pemberton saw me laughing at something he said and invented a scandal to suit her purposes. Perhaps because she wanted him for her niece, or perhaps simply because she enjoys cruelty. But there was no truth to her accusations. Relief washed visibly across his face, so obvious that it startled me. "You believed me," I said slowly, "even before you asked. You stepped forward last night not knowing if I was guilty or innocent." "I know you, Eleanor," he said, using my given name for the first time since he had arrived. "I knew you 5 years ago, and I know you now. Whatever else happened between us, I never doubted your character or your honesty. If you say there was no impropriety, then there was none." Something in my chest loosened at his words, some knot I had not realized I was carrying. He believed me. After 5 years of silence and separation, after all the pain and misunderstanding, he still knew me well enough to trust my word, without question. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for believing me, for defending me, for this." He stood then, recognizing that the visit had reached its natural conclusion. We had said what needed to be said, at least for now. There would be more conversations ahead, more moments of navigating this strange new relationship we were building. But for today, this was enough. "I will call for you tomorrow at 2 o'clock, he said, resuming the formal tone. "If the weather permits, we will take a turn through Hyde Park. If not, perhaps a visit to Hatchard's. We should be seen in public, but not in a way that appears staged." I walked him to the door, maintaining the proper distance even though some part of me wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to bridge the physical space that matched the emotional distance we had carried for so long. But we were not ready for that. Perhaps we would never be ready for it. Some things, once broken, could not be perfectly repaired. At the threshold he paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Eleanor," he said, not looking at me, "I am glad you accepted me as your champion. Not just because it was the right thing to do, but because it gives us a chance to speak again, to perhaps find some way forward that is not just silence and avoidance." "I am glad too," I said, and meant it despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the uncertainty of what came next. He left then, and I watched through the front window as he climbed into his carriage and disappeared into the rainy afternoon. Mrs. Davies appeared at my elbow with fresh tea and a look that was equal parts curiosity and concern. "Will you be all right, my lady?" she asked. "I do not know," I told her honestly, "but I think perhaps I am willing to try to be." That night I could not sleep. I lay in my bed listening to the rain and thinking about the boy Christopher had been when we first met. All earnest intensity and carefully hidden vulnerability. He had been 23 to my 19, already burdened with the responsibilities of being his father's heir, but not yet worn down by them. We had met at a garden party, one of those endless summer afternoons where young people were thrown together in the hope that appropriate matches would emerge. He had been different from the other young men, less concerned with sporting talk and more interested in actual conversation. We had walked through the rose garden and discussed poetry, of all things, and when he looked at me, I had felt seen in a way I never had before. The courtship that followed had been dizzyingly swift. 6 months of walks and dances and chaperoned visits. 6 months of falling so completely in love that I could not imagine a future that did not include him. And then one morning, it had all ended, and I had learned that love was not enough against the weight of duty and necessity and the cold mathematics of survival. Now he was back in my life, bound to me by honor and the strange customs of a society that valued reputation above almost everything else. In 3 days, he would no longer be obligated to maintain contact with me. The question that kept me awake was whether he would choose to anyway, whether we could build something new from the ruins of what we had lost, or whether this was simply a brief interlude before we returned to our separate lives and the careful avoidance we had practiced for 5 years. I did not have answers. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the rain slow and finally stop, I realized that I wanted the chance to find them. That whatever came next, whether reconciliation or simply peace, I was no longer content to live in the half-life I had built for myself. Christopher's return had cracked something open inside me, some sealed chamber where I had locked away hope and possibility, and the belief that my story was not yet finished. Tomorrow we would drive through the park and be seen together. We would play our parts as champion and defended, maintaining the facade that society required. But underneath that performance, something else was happening, something fragile and uncertain and possibly doomed. But something nonetheless. I fell asleep finally as dawn began to gray the windows, and I dreamed of rose gardens and summer afternoons and a young man with blue eyes who had once made me believe in forever. The weather cleared overnight, leaving London washed clean and glittering under pale November sunshine. I dressed with more care than I wanted to admit, choosing a walking dress of deep burgundy wool with black trim that struck the balance between widow's restraint and the subtle acknowledgement that I was no longer in full mourning. My maid Sarah pinned my dark hair in a style that was elegant without being ostentatious, and I studied my reflection in the mirror, wondering what Christopher would see when he looked at me. Whether he would notice the fine lines that had appeared at the corners of my eyes, the slight hollowness in my cheeks that came from too many nights of poor sleep and careful economy. I was 27 now, no longer the girl he had courted. But then, he was not the same man either. He arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, driving himself in an open barouche rather than bringing a coachman. The intimacy of it struck me immediately. This was not meant to be a formal outing, but something more personal, even as it served the public purpose of demonstrating his role as my champion. He descended to hand me up himself, and when his gloved fingers closed around mine, I felt the contact even through the layers of kid leather. The park was fashionably full despite the chill in the air. Hyde Park in the afternoon was where society came to see and be seen, where reputations were made or destroyed in the span of a carriage ride. I was acutely conscious of the turning heads as we entered Rotten Row, the subtle repositioning of carriages to allow better views, the opera glasses that were suddenly finding our direction fascinating. This was the point, of course, to be seen together to make it clear that the Duke of Thornfield stood behind Lady Ashford and that anyone who wished to question my character would have to answer to him first. But underneath the performance, there was something else happening. Christopher drove with easy competence, his hands light on the reins, and he kept up a steady stream of neutral conversation about the weather and the park and the new plantings near the Serpentine. Safe topics, suitable for public consumption. Yet every so often his eyes would meet mine, and I would see something deeper there. Some question or acknowledgement that we were both playing a part while trying to navigate something much more complicated underneath. We encountered Lord and Lady Ashworth near the bridge, their carriage pulling alongside ours with the inevitability of social obligation. Lady Ashworth had been a friend of my late mother's, and she had maintained that friendship through my own marriage and widowhood with a steadiness I had valued. Her shrewd eyes took in everything about our pairing in a single glance, but her greeting was warmly correct. "Lady Ashford, how delightful to see you looking so well," she said. "And your Grace, what a pleasure. I understand congratulations are in order for your championship of our dear Eleanor." Such a gallant gesture. Christopher executed a slight bow from his seat. "Lady Ashford's character needs no defense from me," he said smoothly. "I merely stood as witness to what anyone of sense already knows, that she is a woman of impeccable integrity." It was perfectly said, striking exactly the right tone of formal support without melodrama. Lady Ashworth smiled with genuine warmth. "Quite right, Your Grace." I confess I was appalled by the entire incident. Lady Pemberton has always had more ambition than judgment. I suspect she is regretting her impulsiveness now. "I suspect you are correct," I said, finding my voice. "It is kind of you to say so." We continued on after brief pleasantries, but I knew the encounter would be reported throughout drawing rooms by evening. Lady Ashworth was well connected and well respected. Her approval carried weight. Christopher had known that, of course. He was proving to be remarkably strategic about this entire endeavor, understanding not just the letter of social obligation, but the unwritten rules that governed reputation and standing. "You planned that," I said, once we were out of earshot. "You knew they would be here at this hour." He had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "Lady Ashworth drives in the park every Tuesday at 2:30. I thought it would be useful for you to be seen with both of us. Her endorsement matters." "You are very calculating," I observed, but there was no accusation in it, only a kind of wondering appreciation for the care he was taking. "I learned to be," he said quietly. "The years after my father died taught me that survival often depends on understanding the field of play, not just in matters of estate management, but in society as well. One misstep can cost everything." "Is that how you see this?" I asked. "As a field of play where one wrong move means destruction?" He was silent for a long moment, guiding the horses around a slower carriage before answering. "I used to see it that way," he said finally. "When I married Catherine, when I was trying to save the estates and fulfill every obligation that had been placed on me before I was ready for them. Everything felt like strategy and survival. But these past few days, being with you again, I am remembering that there are some things that cannot be reduced to tactics and planning." "What things?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and the intensity in his blue eyes made my breath catch. "Things like this," he said, "like sitting beside you and trying to remember how to simply be honest instead of carefully managed. Like realizing I have missed you every single day for 5 years and have been too proud or too frightened to admit it." "Christopher," I began, but he shook his head. "Wait," he said. "Please, let me finish before I lose my nerve. When I married Catherine, I told myself I was doing the honorable thing, saving the estates, protecting the people who depended on me, fulfilling my duty as my father's son. And those things were true. But I also used them as armor against my own feelings. I convinced myself that letting you go was noble, when really it was just easier than fighting for what I wanted. Easier than asking my father to wait, to give me time to find another solution. Easier than admitting that I needed help. The park moved around us in a blur of color and movement, but I could focus only on him, on the raw honesty in his voice. I had never heard him speak this way before, even in the early days of our courtship, when everything had seemed possible. He had always maintained some level of control, some careful distance, even in intimacy. Now that distance was gone, and I was seeing him completely unguarded for the first time. "Catherine was kind to me," he continued, "kinder than I deserved. She knew I did not love her, and she never reproached me for it. When she became ill last year, I tried to be what she needed. I held her hand and read to her and made sure she had the best physician's money could buy. But I could not give her my heart, because I had already given it to someone else years before and never taken it back. I could not speak. My throat had closed around words that would not form. Around me, the fashionable world of Hyde Park continued its afternoon ritual, but I felt utterly removed from it. Suspended in this moment with this man who was telling me things I had dreamed of hearing and feared I never would. "When she died," he said, his voice dropping lower, "I grieved for her, for the life she should have had, for the unfairness of dying so young with so much left unlived. But I also felt something else that shamed me, relief. Not because she was gone, but because I was finally free. Free from the pretense, free from the weight of knowing I was failing her every day by not being the husband she deserved. And then I went to that ball at Harrogate House 2 nights ago, and I saw you standing there under attack, and I thought that perhaps freedom means something different than I had imagined. Perhaps it means finally having the courage to choose what I want instead of what everyone else needs from me." "What do you want?" I whispered, because I had to know, even though the answer terrified me. He pulled the carriage to a stop near a grove of trees where we had some slight privacy from the main flow of traffic. "A chance," he said simply. "A chance to see if what we had 5 years ago was real, or just the foolishness of youth. A chance to know you again, Eleanor, not as a memory I have been carrying, but as the woman you are now. A chance to discover whether you could ever forgive me enough to let me try to be worthy of you." The world tilted on its axis and righted itself into a new configuration. All the careful distance I had been maintaining, all the protection I had built around my heart, suddenly felt like prison walls rather than safety. I had spent 5 years telling myself I was over him, that the love I had felt was just youthful infatuation burned away by the harsh reality of his betrayal. But sitting beside him now, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes and hearing the raw honesty in his voice, I knew I had been lying to myself. "I never stopped loving you," I said, and the words came out broken but true. I tried to. I told myself I hated you, and that was easier to bear than admitting I still cared. When Thomas proposed, I accepted him because he was kind, and because I thought perhaps I could learn to love someone else. And I did care for him, Christopher. I mourned him when he died. But I never loved him the way I loved you. I never stopped loving you, even when I wished I could. His hand found mine where it rested on the seat between us, his fingers threading through mine with a rightness that made my chest ache. "I do not deserve you," he said. "I know that. I failed you once already, and I have no right to ask for another chance. But I am asking anyway. Not today. Not while I am still bound to you as your champion, and everything is complicated by social obligation. But when this is over, when the 3 days have passed and you are free of scandal, I want to court you properly, the way I should have done the first time, with honesty and patience and no secrets between us." I thought of all the reasons I should say no. The pain he had caused me, the years I had lost grieving for him, the risk of being hurt again. But I thought, too, of the man he had become, shaped by loss and responsibility into someone who could finally speak truth without armor, of the way my heart had recognized him, even through the pain, even through the years of silence. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like jumping from a cliff into unknown water. "Yes, I would like that. I would like to see if we can find our way back to each other, or perhaps forward to something new." Relief and joy transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Thank you," he said. "I promise you, Eleanor, I will not fail you again. I will spend whatever time you give me proving that I have learned what matters, that I finally understand the difference between duty and choice, between what I owe others and what I owe myself." We sat there for a long moment, hands clasped, before the sound of approaching hooves reminded us that we were in public and being observed. Christopher resumed driving with visible reluctance, and we spoke of lighter things as we completed our circuit of the park. But everything had changed. The performance we were giving for society's benefit had become something real and precious, a foundation we were building for a future we had both thought lost. By the time he delivered me back to my house in Bloomsbury, the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, and the air had taken on the crystal quality that November afternoons sometimes achieved. He handed me down from the carriage and held my fingers a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I will call for you at 8 this evening," he said, "for Lady Hartwell's music hall. I will be ready," I promised. That evening, I dressed in the finest gown I still owned, a creation of midnight blue silk that I had not worn since before Thomas died. Sarah styled my hair with silver pins that had been my mother's, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw not a widow trying to fade into shadows, but a woman preparing for something that might be a new beginning. Christopher arrived in formal evening clothes that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders, and the look in his eyes when he saw me was worth every moment of preparation. "You are beautiful," he said quietly, and I heard in his voice that he was not just complying with social convention, but speaking simple truth. Lady Hartwell's London house was in Mayfair, a gracious Georgian building that glowed with candlelight from every window. The musicale was a smaller affair than the Harrogate Ball, perhaps 50 guests rather than hundreds, but the attendance was select. I recognized members of the highest circles of society, people whose approval could make or break a reputation. Christopher had chosen well. To be accepted here, under his escort and with Lady Hartwell's implicit endorsement, would do more for my social standing than any amount of protestation could. Lady Hartwell herself greeted us in the entrance hall, a formidable woman in her 70s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had been a great beauty in her youth and retained the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She embraced Christopher with genuine affection before turning to me. "Lady Ashford," she said, taking my hands in hers, "I am delighted Christopher has brought you. I knew your mother when we were girls. You have her look about you, particularly the eyes. She was one of the finest women I ever knew." "Thank you, Lady Hartwell," I said, touched by the warmth in her voice. "That means a great deal to me." She patted my hand before releasing it. "Come, both of you. We will have some atrocious singing and some surprisingly good piano. And perhaps, if we are fortunate, my nephew will refrain from attempting to discuss his hunting exploits. One can always hope." The evening that followed was both ordeal and revelation. I was intensely conscious of being watched, evaluated, judged by every person in the room. Some regarded me with curiosity, others with the faint disdain that suggested they had heard Lady Pemberton's version of events and found me wanting. But many more offered genuine warmth, influenced no doubt by Christopher's presence at my side and Lady Hartwell's obvious approval. We sat together during the performances, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him along my side, and he leaned over periodically to murmur observations that made me smile despite my nervousness. During the interval, he brought me champagne and introduced me to several people who might have otherwise remained distant. I watched him work the room with subtle skill, always including me in conversation, always treating me with a respect that spoke volumes about how I should be regarded. But it was a small moment late in the evening that meant the most to me. We had stepped into the conservatory for a breath of cooler air, escaping the press of bodies and the heat of too many candles. The glass room was dimly lit, filled with the green smell of growing things and the sound of a fountain trickling somewhere in the shadows. We stood by the windows, looking out at the darkened garden, and for the first time that evening, we were relatively alone. "You have been extraordinary tonight," Christopher said quietly. "I know this cannot be easy for you, being on display this way, but you have carried yourself with such grace." "I have had practice," I said, thinking of the years after Thomas died when I had to navigate society as a widow with limited means and no powerful family to support me. "One learns to smile and curtsy and pretend everything is fine, even when it is not. You should not have had to do that alone," he said. "If I had been braver 5 years ago, if I had fought harder, perhaps you would not have had to learn those survival skills." I turned to face him, the moonlight through the glass turning his face into plains of silver and shadow. "We cannot change the past," I said. "We can only decide what to do with what we have now." "And what do we have now?" he asked, and I heard the vulnerability in the question. "A chance," I said, echoing his words from earlier. "A fragile, complicated, possibly doomed chance at something that might be wonderful if we are both brave enough." He reached up and touched my cheek with careful fingers, a gesture so tender it made my breath catch. "I will be brave enough," he promised, "if you will let me try." I leaned into his touch, allowing myself for the first time in 5 years to want this, to hope for this, to believe that perhaps some broken things could be mended if both people were willing to do the work. "I will let you try," I said. We stood there for a long moment, close enough to kiss, but not quite crossing that final distance. Not yet. Not while the evening was still unfinished, and we were supposed to be merely champion and defended. but the promise hung between us. The knowledge that, when the time was right, when propriety allowed, we would find our way back to each other fully. Lady Hartwell found us eventually, her knowing smile suggesting she understood exactly what she was interrupting. "Come," she said. "The evening is ending, and people will want to pay their respects before departing. Let them see you together once more, and then Christopher can take you home properly chaperoned by my approval." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of farewells and gracious words. By the time Christopher handed me into his carriage for the drive back to Bloomsbury, I was exhausted, but lighter somehow, as though a weight I had been carrying for years had finally eased. "Tomorrow is the last day," I said as we drove through the quiet streets. "The last of the 3 days Lady Pemberton has to bring formal charges." "She will not," Christopher said with certainty. "She knows she has lost. You have been seen with me repeatedly, accepted by Lady Hartwell and Lady Ashworth and a dozen others whose opinions matter. To press charges now would be social suicide for her. By tomorrow evening you will be free of this entire situation." "And then?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "And then," he said, taking my hand in the darkness of the carriage, "we begin again. Properly this time, with all the time we need to find our way forward." When we reached my house, he insisted on walking me to the door despite the late hour. On the threshold, he lifted my hand and pressed a kiss to my gloved knuckles, the gesture formal, but weighted with all the things we were not yet saying aloud. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. "Sleep well." "I will try," I said, though I knew sleep would be difficult with my mind racing through everything that had happened, everything that might still happen. I stood at my window after he had gone, watching his carriage disappear into the night, and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in 5 long years. Not just hope, but the beginning of joy. The cautious, fragile, terrifying joy of second chances and new beginnings, and the possibility that love, once lost, might be found again if both people were willing to reach for it. Tomorrow would bring the end of this strange 3-day period. Tomorrow my reputation would be secured, and Christopher would no longer be bound to me by obligation. Tomorrow we would discover whether the connection we had rebuilt could survive without the framework of formal duty to hold it together. I was afraid, but I was no longer hiding from that fear. I was ready, finally, to be brave enough to try. The 3rd day dawned gray and cold, winter asserting itself with the kind of chill that penetrated even the thickest wool. I woke before dawn and could not return to sleep, my mind turning over everything that would change once this day ended. By nightfall, the 3 days would have passed, and Lady Pemberton's opportunity to bring formal charges would expire. Christopher would no longer be bound to me as my champion. We would simply be 2 people who had once loved each other and were trying to find their way back to something that might be love again, or might be merely the ghost of it. I spent the morning attending to correspondence I had been neglecting, writing thank-you notes to Lady Hartwell and Lady Ashworth and several others who had shown kindness during the musical. The words came easier than I expected, perhaps because I was no longer writing as someone desperate to maintain tenuous social standing, but as someone who had been publicly defended and accepted. The shift was subtle but profound. I had entered that ballroom 3 nights ago as a widow of modest means and questionable reputation. I would emerge from this day as someone whose character had been vouched for by a duke and whose worth had been demonstrated through the support of society's most respected voices. But underneath the relief and gratitude, there was fear. The fear that once the formal structure of championship dissolved, Christopher might discover that what he felt was obligation rather than genuine feeling. Or worse, that I might discover my own emotions were more about the romance of reconciliation than the reality of who we had both become. Mrs. Davies brought me tea mid-morning, along with a calling card on a silver tray. The Dowager Duchess of Thornfield had come to call, and she was waiting in my front parlor. My hands went cold around the teacup. Christopher's mother. I had met her exactly twice, both times during our brief courtship 5 years ago. She had been polite, but distant, the kind of woman who measured everyone against the standards of her own impeccable bloodline and found most people wanting. She had not approved of the match between her son and a baron's daughter with a modest dowry, and she had made that disapproval clear through studied courtesy that was more cutting than direct rudeness could ever be. I dressed quickly in a morning gown of charcoal gray and went downstairs with my spine very straight and my hands steady through sheer force of will. Whatever she had come to say, I would face it with dignity. The dowager was seated on my best chair, her posture perfect, her silver hair dressed in a style that had been fashionable 30 years ago, and which she maintained with the determination of someone who had decided what suited her and saw no reason to change. She wore black silk, still in mourning for Catherine, and her dark eyes swept over me with the same assessing gaze I remembered from 5 years before. "Lady Ashford," she said, inclining her head in what might generously be called a greeting. "Your Grace," I replied, curtsying with exact correctness. "This is an unexpected honor." She made a sound that might have been amusement or disapproval. "I am not certain honor is the correct word," she said, "but it is certainly unexpected. I do not make social calls as a general rule, and I particularly do not call upon young women who have managed to entangle my son in public scandal." The words were a slap delivered with aristocratic precision. I remained standing, refusing to sit until invited, and met her gaze without flinching. "I did not entangle your son in anything, Your Grace. He chose to act as my champion of his own volition." I was as surprised as anyone when he stepped forward. "Surprised?" she repeated, and now the skepticism was unmistakable. How convenient. My son, who has spent 5 years carefully avoiding any connection to you, suddenly decides to tie his name and reputation to yours in the most public manner possible. You will forgive me if I find the timing rather calculated. I felt anger rise hot in my chest, but kept my voice level. "If you are suggesting I somehow engineered Lady Pemberton's accusations in order to manipulate your son, then you do not know me at all. I wanted nothing more than to be left alone to live my life quietly. Christopher made his own choice for his own reasons. If you take issue with that choice, perhaps you should direct your concerns to him rather than to me." Her eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication that my words had surprised her. "You have developed something of a spine since I last saw you," she observed. 5 years ago, you would have wept and apologized. 5 years ago, I was a girl who wanted desperately to be accepted by my intended husband's family, I said. I am no longer that girl. Life has taught me that approval must be earned through character rather than begged for through submission. We regarded each other across the small parlor, and I saw her reassess me with eyes that were sharp despite her age. Finally, she gestured to the chair opposite her own. "Sit," she said. "If we are to have this conversation, we might as well be comfortable." I sat, grateful despite myself for the permission to do so. My legs had been trembling, and standing much longer would have revealed that weakness. The dowager studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "Christopher has been to see me," she said. "Yesterday, after your appearance at Lady Hartwell's musicale, he informed me that he intends to court you properly once this championship business is concluded, that he wishes to marry you, in fact, if you will have him." My heart lurched at hearing it stated so baldly, even though Christopher and I had discussed something similar in more tentative terms. "He said that?" "He did," she confirmed. "He was quite clear about his intentions. He also made it clear that my approval or lack thereof would not influence his decision. That he has learned, apparently, to choose his own path, rather than allowing family obligation to dictate his life." There was something in her voice I could not quite identify. Not anger exactly, though there was an edge to her words. Something more complex, layered with old pain and perhaps a touch of what might have been regret. "You disapprove," I said quietly. "You think I am unsuitable for him, that I was unsuitable 5 years ago and remain so now." She was silent for a moment, her fingers tracing the carved arm of the chair. "What I think," she said finally, "is that I made mistakes with my son. I pushed him toward a marriage that served the family's financial needs without considering what it would cost him personally. Catherine was a good girl from a respectable family with a fortune we desperately needed. On paper, it was an excellent match. But I watched my son marry a woman he did not love, and I watched him spend 5 years being dutiful and miserable in equal measure. When Catherine died, I saw relief in his eyes even as he grieved. That relief shamed him, but it shamed me more, because I had helped create that situation. I had not expected this honesty, this admission of culpability. The Dowager Duchess had always seemed carved from marble, untouchable and unbending. To hear vulnerability in her voice was profoundly disorienting. "I do not know you well, Lady Ashford," she continued. "I made judgments about you 5 years ago, based on your family's standing and your dowry, rather than on your character. That was foolish of me, particularly given that my own family's finances were in shambles at the time, and we were hardly in a position to be snobbish about anyone else's circumstances." She paused, and when she looked at me again, there was something softer in her expression. "But Christopher knows you. He knew you then, and he knows you now, and he has chosen you twice. Once, when he was young and foolish enough to think love alone could solve every problem. And now, when he is older and wiser and understands exactly what he is choosing and why." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, because I genuinely could not understand her purpose in coming here. "Because I want you to understand what you would be taking on if you accept him," she said bluntly. "Christopher carries guilt like other men carry pocket watches. He will try to make up for the past 5 years for the rest of his life if you let him. He will second-guess himself and wonder if he deserves happiness and attempt to prove his worth to you daily. You will need to be strong enough to tell him when he is being foolish, wise enough to help him learn to forgive himself, and patient enough to allow him to grow into the man he is trying to become." I absorbed this, recognizing truth in her assessment of her son. "I have learned something of strength and wisdom and patience," I said quietly. "Widowhood and financial struggle are effective teachers. I am not the girl I was 5 years ago either, Your Grace. I have been shaped by loss and survival into someone who understands that love is work as much as feeling, that it requires choice and commitment and the willingness to forgive imperfection in oneself and in another." She nodded slowly, as though I had passed some test I had not known I was taking. "Good," she said. "Then perhaps you will be able to manage him after all." She rose, smoothing her skirts with elegant precision. "I am not giving you my blessing, Lady Ashford. I am too proud and too old to pretend sudden enthusiasm for a match I once opposed. But I am not standing in your way either. If Christopher chooses you, and if you choose him, I will accept it with whatever grace I can muster. And perhaps in time I might even come to approve. Stranger things have happened." "Thank you," I said, standing as well. I am not entirely certain what just occurred, but I believe it might have been something approaching acceptance." The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You are more perceptive than I gave you credit for," she said. "Perhaps that is why Christopher loves you." She moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Lady Ashford. If you hurt my son, if you prove unworthy of the faith he is placing in you, I will make you regret it in ways you cannot currently imagine. I may have learned from my mistakes, but I am still a mother. And mothers protect their children even when those children no longer require protection. I would expect nothing less, Your Grace," I said, and meant it. If I were capable of hurting him deliberately, I would not be worth loving in the first place. She left then, sweeping out of my modest house with the same regal bearing she had brought in. Mrs. Davies appeared at my elbow almost immediately, her eyes wide with curiosity and concern. "Well, my lady," she said, "that was something." "That," I agreed, "is certainly one way to describe it." I spent the rest of the morning in a strange state of nervous energy, unable to settle to any task. The dowager's visit had shaken something loose inside me, some last remnant of doubt or fear. If Christopher's formidable mother could acknowledge her past mistakes and offer something approaching acceptance, then perhaps I could allow myself to believe this was real, that we truly had a chance at building something lasting. Christopher called in the early afternoon, arriving without prior notice in a way that suggested urgency. Mrs. Davies showed him into the small sitting room where I had been attempting and failing to focus on a book, and the moment I saw his face, I knew something had happened. "What is it?" I asked, setting the book aside. "What has occurred?" "Lady Pemberton," he said, and there was grim satisfaction in his voice. "She has left London, departed this morning for her brother's estate in Gloucestershire, claiming sudden concern for her health. She will not be bringing any charges." The matter is closed. Relief washed through me so strongly I had to sit down. "It is over then," I said. "Truly over." "It is over," he confirmed, coming to sit beside me. "You are free, Eleanor. Your reputation is restored and strengthened. No one will question your character now." I should have felt only relief and joy, but what I felt instead was a strange emptiness. The crisis that had brought Christopher back into my life was resolved. The external pressure that had forced us together was gone. Now we would discover whether what we had rebuilt could stand on its own. Christopher seemed to sense my thoughts because he took my hand in both of his. "The championship is ended," he said quietly. "But I hope very much that this is not, that we are not." "I want that too," I said, but the words came out hesitant. "I am afraid, Christopher, afraid that without the structure of obligation, we will discover we were play-acting. That the intensity we felt was born of circumstance rather than genuine connection." He shifted closer, and the warmth of him along my side was reassuring in a way words could not be. "Then let us find out," he said. "Let us take time to truly know each other again, without the pressure of scandal or social obligation. Let me court you properly, Eleanor. Slowly, carefully, with all the patience I did not have 5 years ago. Let me prove to you that what I feel is not born of guilt or nostalgia, but of recognizing in you everything I want in a partner and a wife." "A wife," I repeated, and the word felt both terrifying and wonderful. "You are certain? Even knowing that I come with no great fortune or family connections? That I am a widow with a modest household and a past that includes loving and losing another man?" "I am certain," he said firmly. "I do not want a fortune or connections. I want you." The woman who stood with such dignity while society judged her. The woman who learned to survive alone and found strength in that survival. The woman who is brave enough to consider forgiving me even though I do not deserve it. That is who I want, Eleanor. Not some idealized memory, but the real woman sitting beside me now. "Then yes," I said, and felt something unlock in my chest as I spoke. "Yes, I will let you court me. I will give us both time to be certain. And if at the end of that time we still feel as we do now, then perhaps we can speak of more permanent things." He lifted my hand and pressed a kiss to my palm, intimate and tender in a way that made my breath catch. "Thank you," he said. "I will not fail you again. I promise you that." "My mother came to call on me this morning," I said, "because he should know. She was surprisingly honest about her past mistakes and her concerns about you. She informed me that I would need to be strong and wise and patient if I took you on." He grimaced. "That sounds like her. Did she threaten you?" "Only in the most aristocratic manner possible," I said. "I believe we reached an understanding. She is not blessing us with enthusiasm, but she is not standing in our way either." "That is more than I expected from her," Christopher admitted. "She has been softened by loss, I think. Catherine's death reminded her that life is short and that holding grudges serves no one. She may never be warm, but she can at least be civil." We sat together as the afternoon light shifted across the room, not speaking, but not needing to. There was comfort in the simple presence of each other, in knowing that we had time now to explore this connection without external pressure forcing our pace. When he rose to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at me. "Tomorrow," he said, "I would like to take you to Thornfield, the country estate, not the London house. I want you to see it, to understand what I was trying to say 5 years ago, if that is agreeable to you." "I would like that," I said, realizing it was true. I wanted to see the place that had shaped him, the responsibility that had driven his choices. I wanted to understand all of him, not just the parts that fit comfortably into my idea of who he should be. After he left, I stood at the window and watched dusk settle over Bloomsbury, painting the modest houses in shades of purple and gray. The crisis was over. The public drama had resolved itself. Now came the harder, quieter work of building something real from the fragile foundation we had created. I thought about the girl I had been 5 years ago, so certain that love alone could overcome any obstacle. She had been naive, but not entirely foolish. Love mattered, but so did patience and forgiveness and the willingness to see another person clearly without the softening filter of romance. I was no longer that girl. I had been shaped by loss and hardship into someone stronger, someone capable of choosing with her eyes open rather than her heart alone. And Christopher had been shaped as well, carved by duty and grief into a man who finally understood the difference between obligation and choice. Perhaps that was what second chances required. Not a return to youthful passion, but a mature understanding of what love truly demanded, the work of it, the patience, the forgiveness of imperfection in oneself and in another. The choice, made daily, to stay and build rather than flee when difficulty arose. The 3 days were over. Lady Pemberton was gone. My reputation was restored. And Christopher and I stood at the beginning of something that might be wonderful, or might be merely adequate, or might fall apart entirely. There were no guarantees, no certainty that we would succeed where we had failed before. But we were both willing to try. And perhaps that willingness, that choice to reach for each other, despite the risks, was the only foundation worth building on. Tomorrow, we would drive to Thornfield, and I would see the estates that had once been more important than our love. I would walk through the halls where Christopher had grown up, meet the people who depended on him, understand the weight of responsibility he carried, and he would see my reaction to all of it, would gauge whether I could accept the reality of his life rather than just the romantic idea of it. It would be a test of sorts, though not one either of us would name as such. A chance to discover whether what we felt could survive daylight and ordinary life, and the mundane realities of running great estates and managing complicated families. I was nervous, but no longer afraid. Whatever tomorrow brought, I would face it as I had faced everything else these past 5 years, with dignity and honesty, and the quiet strength that came from having survived worse than uncertainty. The evening settled fully into night, and I lit candles against the darkness. Somewhere across London, Christopher was likely doing the same, preparing for sleep while his mind turned over plans for tomorrow. We were separate still, living separate lives in separate houses. But we were no longer avoiding each other, no longer pretending the past had not happened or that we meant nothing to each other. That was progress, small, fragile, but real. And sometimes real progress was all one could ask for. The rest would come, or it would not, in its own time and its own way. All we could do was show up honestly and see what unfolded. I went to bed that night with something I had not felt in a very long time. Not just hope, which was too passive a word, but intention. The determination to pursue this chance Christopher had given us, to do the work required to build something lasting and true. The 3 days were over, and we were only just beginning. Thornfield lay 2 hours north of London, set in rolling countryside that had turned golden and brown with the season's change. Christopher drove us himself again, preferring the intimacy of his curricle to the formality of a closed carriage with servants. The November morning was crisp and bright. the kind of day where the air tasted clean and the sky stretched endlessly blue above bare-branched trees. We spoke of small things during the drive, comfortable silences interspersed with observations about the landscape and occasional stories from his childhood spent racing across these same roads. But underneath the easy conversation, I felt the weight of what this visit meant. I was being invited into the heart of his world, the place that had shaped him and demanded so much from him. The estates that had been worth more than our love 5 years ago. I needed to see them not with resentment, but with understanding, to comprehend what he had been trying to protect when he made the choice that broke both our hearts. The first glimpse of Thornfield House took my breath away. It rose from a slight hill, 3 stories of honey-colored stone that glowed in the morning sun. The architecture was Elizabethan, all mullioned windows and decorative chimneys, softened by centuries of weather into something that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Gardens stretched in formal patterns around the house, and beyond them I could see parkland dotted with ancient oaks and the silver glint of a lake. It was beautiful in a way that went beyond mere aesthetics. It was history made visible, generations of careful stewardship and devotion. Looking at it, I understood with sudden clarity what Christopher had faced 5 years ago. This was not just a house or an estate. It was the accumulated weight of 300 years of family history, of people who had lived and died in those rooms, of tenants and servants whose livelihoods depended on its continued prosperity. To let it fall into ruin would have been more than personal failure. It would have been a betrayal of everyone who had come before and everyone who depended on what came after. "It is magnificent," I said quietly, and heard in my own voice that I meant more than just architectural appreciation. Christopher looked at me, and I saw relief in his eyes that I understood. "My father almost lost it," he said. "He was a good man, but a terrible manager of money. Too generous with friends, too trusting in bad investments. By the time he died, the debts were crushing. I was 23 years old and suddenly responsible for saving something I had barely begun to understand. The Lindley fortune was the only option available that would have provided enough capital quickly enough to prevent foreclosure. "And so you married Catherine," I said, looking at the house rather than at him. "And saved all of this. And destroyed us," he added quietly. "The cost was higher than I understood at the time. I thought I was being noble, sacrificing personal happiness for the greater good. But nobility is a cold companion, Eleanor. It does not keep you warm at night or make you forget what you have given up." We drove through the main gates and up the long drive, and I saw people beginning to emerge from various buildings. Servants and groundskeepers, tenant farmers and stable hands, drawn by news that the Duke had returned and brought a guest. Their faces were curious but welcoming, and I realized with a start that they were assessing me, trying to determine whether I would be good for their master, whether I understood and valued what they all worked to maintain. Christopher handed me down in the main courtyard, and the household staff had assembled in a neat line to greet us. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, a formidable woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair and shrewd eyes. Mr. Graves, the butler, elderly and dignified. Cook and several maids whose names I tried to commit to memory. They curtsied and bowed as Christopher introduced me, and I saw calculation in every gaze. They knew who I was. They remembered that I had been connected to their master 5 years ago. They were wondering what my presence here now signified. Christopher led me inside, and the house unfolded around me like a story told in wood and stone. The entrance hall soared 2 stories high, paneled in dark oak and hung with portraits of Thornfield ancestors. A grand staircase swept upward, its banister worn smooth by centuries of hands. Everything spoke of age and continuity, of lives lived and remembered. He showed me through the main rooms with a mixture of pride and vulnerability. The library where he had spent childhood afternoons reading while rain drummed against windows. The portrait gallery where generations of Thornfield dukes stared down with varying degrees of severity or kindness. the drawing room where his mother still presided over tea when she visited from the Dower House. Each room was beautiful and well-maintained, the result of the fortune Catherine had brought and the careful management Christopher had implemented. But it was the small details that touched me most. The worn chair by the library fire that was clearly his favorite. The desk in the estate office piled with ledgers and correspondence, evidence of the endless work required to keep such a place running. The way servants smiled when they saw him, genuine affection rather than mere duty. He was not just the Duke here. He was someone they respected and cared for, someone who had earned their loyalty through years of fair dealing and honest care for their welfare. We took lunch in a smaller dining room that faced the gardens, and over cold chicken and fresh bread, he told me stories about the estate. The Tennant family, whose son had shown remarkable aptitude and whom Christopher had sponsored to attend university. The village school he had helped rebuild after a fire. The improvements made to Tennant cottages, and the careful management of the woods to ensure sustainable timber harvest for generations to come. He spoke not with pride, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing work that simply needed doing. I began to see the man he had become through the responsibility of this place, not the young man I had loved 5 years ago, who had been charming and romantic, but ultimately untested, but someone who had been shaped by duty into a person of depth and purpose, someone who understood that privilege came with obligation, that power meant service rather than indulgence. After lunch, he took me to see the lake, and we walked along its shore while swans glided across water that reflected the sky like polished silver. The air smelled of earth and dying leaves and the faint smoke from distant chimneys. We had left the house behind and were alone except for the landscape and the birds wheeling overhead. "What do you think?" he asked finally, stopping to face me. "Now that you have seen it, now that you understand what I chose over us." "I think," I said slowly, choosing my words with care, "that I finally comprehend the impossible position you were in. This is not just wealth or status, Christopher. This is history and responsibility and hundreds of lives depending on decisions you make. I think the girl I was 5 years ago could not have understood that. She would have seen only that she was not chosen, that something else mattered more. But the woman I am now can see the complexity of it, the way sometimes there are no good choices, only less terrible ones." His shoulders relaxed slightly, as though he had been bracing for condemnation. "But you still wish I had chosen differently," he said. "That is natural. I wish I had found another way as well." "I do wish that," I agreed. "But not because I think you were wrong, Christopher. Because I wish the world were kinder, that love and duty did not have to be at odds, that young people did not have to sacrifice their hearts to save their families. I wish we had been given the luxury of choosing each other without consequence. But we were not given that luxury. You did what you had to do, and I have finally learned to forgive you for it." He closed the distance between us, taking both my hands in his. "And now?" he asked. "Now that you have seen all of this, now that you understand the life I live here, what do you want? Because I will not make the same mistake twice, Eleanor. I will not assume I know what is best for both of us. I will not make decisions without you. If this is too much, if the weight of it feels like a burden rather than a life worth living, tell me now. I would rather know the truth than build false hope." I looked past him to the house on its hill, golden in the afternoon light, and then to the fields beyond where I could see workers moving in the distance. This place was beautiful, but demanding. It would require everything from whoever stood beside Christopher as his duchess. Time and energy, and the willingness to put duty before personal preference in countless small and large ways. It would mean being watched and judged, managing a household of dozens, taking responsibility for tenant welfare and village concerns. It would mean becoming part of something larger than myself. 5 years ago, that would have terrified me. But I had spent 5 years learning to manage my own small household, learning to stretch limited resources and make hard decisions and survive on my own strength. I had learned that I was capable of more than I had known, That responsibility could be fulfilling rather than merely burdensome when it came with genuine purpose. I think, I said, meeting his eyes steadily, that I could love this place as you do. Not because it is grand or beautiful, though it is both, but because it matters. Because the work you do here has meaning beyond mere wealth or status. You are caring for people, Christopher, preserving something worth preserving. And I would be honored to share that work with you if you truly want me. His hands tightened on mine almost painfully. Are you certain? You understand what you would be taking on? The obligations, the scrutiny, the endless demands on your time and energy? I understand better than you think, I said gently. I may not have grown up with an estate of this magnitude, but I understand duty and responsibility. I understand that love is not just feeling, but choice and action, and the daily work of showing up even when it is difficult. I learned those lessons the hard way, Christopher, through loss and grief and having to build a life from very little. I am not afraid of hard work or obligation. What I am afraid of is living the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to try. Then marry me, he said, and the words came out fierce and urgent. Not someday after a proper courtship, not when society deems it appropriate or my mother has been sufficiently appeased. Now, soon as it can be arranged. I have wasted 5 years already, Eleanor. I will not waste another day if you are willing to have me. My heart was racing, but my mind was clear. This was the moment I had been moving toward since he crossed that ballroom 3 nights ago, since he offered himself as my champion and tied his fate to mine. Perhaps since the morning 5 years ago when he walked away and left me heartbroken but not broken. Everything had been leading to this choice, this moment of deciding whether to trust him with my future and my heart. Yes, I said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff into air that might hold me or might let me fall. Yes, I will marry you. Not because I have forgotten the past, or because I need saving, or because Thornfield is beautiful, but because I love you, Christopher. I loved you 5 years ago when we were too young to know what we were doing. I loved you through the pain of losing you, and I love you now as we both are, scarred and wiser and hopefully brave enough to make this work. He pulled me into his arms then, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe, and I felt the shudder that went through him. Thank you, he said into my hair. Thank you for giving me this chance. I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of it. We stood there by the lake while the afternoon light turned golden and the swans continued their gliding dance across the water. There were details to manage still, practical matters like informing families and arranging ceremonies and navigating the social expectations around remarriage. But those were problems for later. For now, there was only this, the two of us choosing each other finally without obligation or pressure forcing our hands. When we returned to the house, the servants read the change in us immediately. Mrs. Patterson's stern face softened into something approaching a smile, and even Mr. Graves looked pleased beneath his professional dignity. They had wanted this, I realized. They had wanted their master to find happiness again, to have more than just duty and responsibility filling his days. Christopher insisted on showing me more of the estate, taking me through the village where tenants touched their caps and women smiled from doorways, their curiosity obvious but not unwelcoming. We visited the church where generations of Thornfields had been christened and married and buried, a stone building surrounded by ancient yews and graves whose inscriptions had been worn smooth by weather. The vicar emerged to greet us, an elderly man with kind eyes who had known Christopher since childhood, and I saw understanding dawn in his expression when Christopher introduced me with careful emphasis on my name. By the time we began the drive back to London, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. We had agreed that Christopher would speak to his mother tomorrow, and I would write to my remaining family. We would marry quietly within a few weeks, without fuss or elaborate ceremony. Neither of us wanted spectacle. We wanted only the substance of the vows, the quiet joy of choosing each other before God and witnesses who mattered. The public would talk, of course. The Duke of Thornfield marrying Lady Ashford so soon after defending her at the Harrogate ball. Some would call it romantic, others scandalous. But we had both learned that public opinion was fickle and ultimately less important than the life we would build together. As London's lights appeared on the horizon, Christopher reached across the seat and took my hand. "I am afraid," he admitted quietly, "not of marrying you, but of failing you again, of letting duty override love at some crucial moment, of being the man I was 5 years ago rather than the man I am trying to become. Then we will remind each other," I said. "We will learn to balance duty and love instead of seeing them as opposing forces. We will make mistakes, Christopher, both of us. We will hurt each other unintentionally and have to find our way back from those hurts. But if we choose each other daily, if we keep choosing honesty over pride and partnership over isolation, then perhaps we can build something that lasts." "You have become very wise," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "When did that happen?" "When I stopped waiting for someone to save me and learned to save myself," I told him, and then learned that saving myself did not mean I had to do everything alone. That, accepting help and partnership, was not weakness, but another kind of strength. He brought my hand to his lips and kissed it with such tenderness I felt tears prick my eyes. "We will save each other then," he said, "when we need it. And we will stand together the rest of the time." We reached my house in Bloomsbury as full dark settled over the city. Christopher walked me to my door and we stood there in the lamplight, reluctant to part, even though we would see each other again the next day. "I will speak to my mother tomorrow morning," he said. "She will not be surprised. I suspect she already guessed my intentions when I took you to Thornfield, and I will begin making arrangements for the license and the ceremony. Unless you want something more elaborate?" "No," I said firmly. "Something small and genuine. Just us and the people who matter most. I have had one elaborate wedding, Christopher. For this one, I want only the vows and the truth of them." He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing my cheeks with exquisite gentleness. "I love you, Eleanor Ashford," he said. "I loved you when I was too young and foolish to fight for you. I loved you through 5 years of marriage to someone else and tried to bury that love under duty and obligation. And I love you now, with everything I am and everything I hope to become. You are the first choice I have made purely for myself in a very long time. And you are the best choice I have ever made. I love you too," I said through tears that were joy rather than sorrow. "I love you enough to try again. Enough to risk being hurt, enough to believe that we can make this work." He kissed me then, soft and careful, a promise rather than a claim. And then he was gone, climbing into his curricle and driving off into the night while I stood watching from my doorstep. Mrs. Davies found me still standing there 10 minutes later, smiling through tears. "My lady," she said gently, "come inside before you catch cold. Whatever has happened, it has clearly been significant." "I am getting married," I told her, and heard the wonder in my own voice. "To the Duke of Thornfield. Soon. Within weeks if it can be arranged." Her face transformed with delight. "Oh, my lady," she said, embracing me with uncharacteristic familiarity. "That is wonderful news. He is a good man, anyone can see that. And he looks at you as though you are the sun and moon and stars all together." I laughed through my tears. "That is rather poetic of you, Mrs. Davies." "Romance suits you, my lady," she said. "You have been too long in shadow. It is good to see you stepping into light again." I went to bed that night with my heart so full it felt like it might burst. In a few weeks I would be Christopher's wife, Duchess of Thornfield, stepping into a life larger and more demanding than anything I had imagined for myself. I would have responsibilities and obligations and the weight of history on my shoulders. But I would also have partnership and love and the daily joy of building something meaningful with someone I admired and cherished. The The girl I had been 5 years ago had wanted a fairy tale, a love that conquered all obstacles through the sheer force of feeling. She had been heartbroken when reality proved more complicated. But the woman I had become understood that real love was better than fairy tales. It was messier and harder and required constant choice and effort. But it was also deeper and more satisfying, built on truth rather than fantasy. I thought of Thornfield glowing golden on its hill, of the people who depended on it, and the man who had been shaped by responsibility into someone capable of great love precisely because he understood the weight of commitment. I thought of the life we would build there together, full of work and purpose and quiet moments stolen between obligations. It would not be perfect. We would argue and disagree and struggle to balance the 1,000 demands on our time and energy. We would carry our scars and have to learn to work around them. We would have to forgive each other's failings and our own with equal grace. But we would do it together, and that made all the difference. The 3 days were long past. The scandal had dissolved into gossip that would fade with time. Lady Pemberton was forgotten, her spite having accomplished nothing but her own diminishment. Christopher was no longer bound to me as champion. I was no longer the subject of society's judgment. We were simply 2 people who had loved and lost and found each other again. 2 people who had learned hard lessons about the cost of love and the value of forgiveness. 2 people who were brave enough or foolish enough to believe that second chances were worth reaching for. I fell asleep with moonlight washing across my bed and the certain knowledge that I had chosen well, that we both had chosen well, that whatever came next would be worth facing because we would face it as partners in truth rather than simply in name. The story was not ending. It was only beginning, and this time we would write it together.